Good evening, everybody. This is Night Flight. I'm Judith Krober, and tonight I have Jerry Marzinsky with me. He has been working as a mental health practitioner and a counselor for 35 years.
Things I was seeing was, doing my rounds in the psychiatric rehab center, and every time the chaplain had a ice cream social down in the main meeting area, all my schizophrenics were on the ward. So here they are sitting on this dingy ward instead of going down there and eating ice cream and cake, which were hard to get hold of there. And I'm like, well, that's odd. And I saw that time after time. And then I started asking them, well, why are you staying up here? Why aren't you down there with the other guys getting ice cream and cake? Well, I don't like church and I don't like preachers, and that's a bunch of crap. And it was consistent. It was like, so I started asking them some questions about, well, why is this? And periodically I'd hit the voices get louder when I go into those places, when I go into the churches. So I started wondering, well, I never took the word of just one patient. I would take the question I asked and then start asking. I had an unlimited supply of schizophrenics there. So I'd start asking these others, and time after time, they'd say, well, yeah, the voices don't like the Bible. They hate the 23rd Psalm. When I read the 23rd Psalm, they act like worms thrown onto a hot frying pan. And I'm like, whoa. So I started handing out the 23rd Psalm, and I got the same response. All these patients said the voices hate it. They hate when I read the Bible. I said, well, what did they tell you? And they said, well, Jesus couldn't even protect himself. What makes you think he's going to protect you? And this is the voices telling them this thing. And I'm like, this is a hallucination. Hallucinations are supposed to be random. I mean, they're supposed to be all over the place. The second thing I noticed later was amphetamine kind of like opened the door to these things. More prisoners were sent to prison for committing crimes while they were psychotic on amphetamine than any other drug that I ever saw. So it's like it opened the door to psychosis. It triggered psychosis, and it was like they were going psychotic, and it was like once they became psychotic, they stayed psychotic. It didn't go away. But what was tricky about it is when they first started, they'd start hearing these voices. They'd go, oh, well, I'm just hallucinating because of the drug. And they're thinking, well, okay, it'll go away. And they stop using the drug, and it does go away. And that happens for many times. And then one day they use it and it doesn't go away. They're there and they can't get rid of them, and they're there forever, and they're now psychotic. Whatever these things were, they invaded. So I started asking questions about amphetamine, and these people would see something called the shadow people consistently. They were three-dimensional shadows that would enter their rooms at night, follow them around, and usually show up at the foot of their bed and be staring down at them. They never spoke. And I noticed, and I actually used this clinically, if they saw their eyes, they were in much worse shape than if they didn't. The majority of them never saw the eyes. If they did see eyes on these shadow people, they were either lime green or they were red. Neither color is not something I'd want to meet somebody with eyes of that color. I mean, right away, it just kind of sends chills up your back. Then I noticed that virtually every schizophrenic who was put on these medications would eventually go off and go psychotic again. And I'm like, well, why is that happening? But, and I'd ask them, and they'd all say, well, it's the side effects. The side effects are awful. And they were. But what didn't make sense is when you compare the side effects, which were bad, to going insane and becoming floridly psychotic. It was like, okay, which do you want? You want the flu or you want the bubonic plague? and they were all choosing the bubonic plague. And I'm like, but what really broke me was the stories that a lot of these prisoners were telling. The first one that we worked on, the first breakthrough I got where we actually got rid of the voices, was this guy who used to work on Wall Street. And he had making tons of money. And he started using a lot of meth and amphetamine. And then he started hearing voices. And he was married for years, and he was hearing voices for years, and his wife never noticed. And I said, how did that happen? How could she not tell? He goes, well, I'd go out into the garage and I'd just talk to him myself, and she'd catch me and I'd just tell her I was just talking to myself. So the voices didn't like his wife. They don't like wives. They hate little kids. They hate the person being in any relationship. What they want to do is poison any relationship so they have the victim all by themselves where they can't get any help. And he came to group one day, and I started working with him. He was one of the chosen guys. And finally, when I learned enough about how to get rid of these things, his voices one day in the office, when we tried this last thing, they disappeared. And they screamed as they left. They were screamed. And he sat there stunned, and he almost fell out of his chair. And I'll never forget his words. He turned at me and he looked and he said, the silence is deafening. Because it was the first time in decades he had not heard the voices. They weren't talking, they were gone. And he was, the voices that these people hear are thoughts being put into their minds. They're being injected into their minds. And not only that, these things have access to their entire memory. So they can go in there and they can pull up every rotten thing these people ever did and bring it up, dredge it up, and rub it in their faces until their emotional state turns negative. And then they drain that energy. So what they are is emotional parasites. And it doesn't just happen with schizophrenics. Remember, the schizophrenics are the 5% of the normal curve. These things are hitting us all to different degrees. And it's most obvious where you're kind of cruising along the street and all of a sudden minding your own business, you have your same old thought stream running there, thinking about this and that. And then a thought comes in that's just horrifying. It's like something you would never think, something you would never do, something you would never consider. And you kind of go, whoa, where did that come from? And from what I've seen is that every negative thought that flows into your head about yourself or somebody else is put there by these entities, and they want you to react to it. And that will generate the negative emotional energy that they feed off of.
Looshing.
You got it right on. That's exactly right. That's exactly right. And that's what it is. They want that loosh, and that's how they generate it.
No one can deny that our world is in trouble. Today, our cities have become battlegrounds, often ruled by gang violence. Every 42 seconds, a violent crime is committed in the United States. Every third of a minute, someone is arrested for drug abuse. 8 million American children are prescribed drugs that cause violence and suicide. Images of murderous school children and acts of senseless violence fill the headlines. None of this just happened.
People aren't aware that in 1940, a prominent British psychiatrist, Colonel J.R. Rees, addressed the National Council on Mental Hygiene and set the agenda for psychiatry for the next 60 years. Since then, psychiatrists have been given authority in nearly every sector of our society, with tragic results.
We must aim to make it permeate every educational activity in our national life. Public life, politics, and industry should all of them be within our sphere of influence. We have made a useful attack upon a number of professions. The two easiest of them, naturally, are the teaching profession and the church. The most difficult are law and medicine.
Rees's colleague, psychiatrist G. Brock Chisholm, co-founder of the World Federation for Mental Health, expanded upon psychiatry's plans.
The reinterpretation and eventually eradication of the concept of right and wrong are the objectives of all psychotherapy. To achieve world government, it is necessary to remove from the minds of men their individualism, loyalty to family traditions, national patriotism, and religious dogmas.
To implement their master plan, American psychiatrists promised the U.S. Congress that they could solve mankind's problems, but only if they were sufficiently bankrolled. Since then, U.S. government funding for psychiatric research alone has gone from $1 million to $1.4 billion a year, an increase of more than 139,000%. And with these funds, psychiatrists accelerated their strategic plan, turning an unsuspecting public into psychiatric victims. They create imaginary diseases that are literally voted into existence and published in their billing Bible, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, or DSM.
DSM is basically an arbitrary classification of thoughts, moods, and behavior decided upon by a committee of psychiatrists, and it's created not by anything scientific. That is, it's not as if there's some study of tissue or some study of the body or some study of matter.
These invented diseases are then treated with barbaric practices and dangerous drugs that are so powerful they are classified with narcotics such as morphine, cocaine, and heroin. And even still, they are prescribed to children. The U.S. government-funded National Institutes of Health assembled a panel of prominent doctors and psychiatrists to explain to the public one of the diseases contained in the DSM: Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder, ADHD.
I would like any member of the panel to describe a typical ADHD in terms of symptomatology. Mark, would you like to? Since you see them in your practice.
I think the panel has been frank, and the difficulties here are immense in terms of these. It is hard. It's very hard to know how to answer this question. They cannot, even when. They are as if driven by a motive. There are some good clinical descriptions. And I think, I think the part of the problem is the profession keeps changing the diagnosis.
At this time, we do not have a diagnostic test for ADHD. Therefore, the validity of the disorder continues to be a problem.
Psychiatrists receive $21 billion a year, prescribing powerful psychotropic drugs to children for a disease that doesn't exist.
It's all a fraud. They spend millions upon millions creating this research and creating this scientific literature to convey the impression to non-scientific medical practitioners that these are brain diseases.
Psychiatrists know full well they can't prove there are any mental diseases, as they openly admitted at their annual convention in 2005.
Psychiatric illness is not really an illness.
How do you evaluate if someone is cured or sick?
Cure is certainly something we look forward to. We had no earthly idea how to accomplish.
You want to treat them even if you don't really exactly know what causes it.
We're not good at causes. We don't know what causes mental illness.
But it hasn't stopped psychiatry from taking billions for treatments and drug prescriptions, while they arrogantly peddle their cures with devastating effects on unsuspecting human guinea pigs.
Mr. Blount has virtually no signs of his original illness now. The signs that the movements of his mouth are completely side effects of the drugs that he was on for 20 years. Mr. Blount is quite rational. He understands what's going on.
Psychiatric health care is big business. Insurance companies pay out $69 billion every year for psychiatric services, doubling the cost of medical insurance premiums. Psychiatry's master plan to infiltrate all sectors of society has become a reality. While psychiatrists are paid $23 billion a year to rehabilitate American prisoners, 2 out of every 3 released convicts return to prison within 3 years. In the past 40 years, money doled out to psychiatrists and psychologists to improve literacy in our schools has soared to $28 billion, while through those same 40 years, functional literacy rates have plunged. Meanwhile, posing as medical doctors, psychiatrists electroshock 2 million people a year, killing 10,000. For $12 worth of electricity, American psychiatrists rake in $5 billion a year. With all their so-called miracle treatments, nearly twice as many Americans have died in government psychiatric hospitals in just the past 4 decades than in all U.S. wars since 1776. So any way you measure it, psychiatry has spelled nothing but ruin. While raking in over $2 trillion every year, they cannot point to a single cure. As unbelievable as all this may seem to you, you are about to learn the facts about psychiatry that psychiatrists would prefer you didn't know. It is because of their influence that society is failing. Something can and must be done.
This is from Wikipedia for causes. The specific causes of ADHD are not known. There are, however, a number of factors that may contribute to or exacerbate ADHD. They include genetics, diet, and the social and physical environments. They don't know what causes ADHD, but let's see. We can make some money by selling a chemical solution. Let's be the most experts, according to the New York Times, who say that it results from abnormal chemical levels. Yeah! Now, this is really fun because diet, like, that's a serious problem. You think if people are designed to eat natural foods and you give them nothing but high fructose corn syrup and processed crap, that it's not going to affect their brains a little bit? That a kid's metabolism is not going to be thrown off when you poison them because the FDA said your food was okay? This is really for parents. Like, please. Genetics. Now, there's a talk about a genetic link to ADHD, and if you think about it as a hyperactivity or a risk-taking kind of personality type phenomenon, yeah, of course there's going to be a genetic component. But what was really interesting here was the evolution theory. At more than 1% of the population, researchers have proposed that the high prevalence of ADHD may be due to natural selection having favored ADHD, possibly because the individual traits may be beneficial on their own and only become dysfunctional when these traits combine to form ADHD. Yeah, the kids with ADHD, they're like super evolved, right? Well, in a sense, yeah, because this is the natural state of a child's mind, to be engaged in learning and assimilating information, to be hyperactive, to be always engaging and experimenting and trying new things and getting out and learning and figuring out how to function to make themselves happy, to be functioning members of society, to be self-guided learners, not to have information crammed down their throats. And by the way, the reason the government wants that is because it's propaganda. It conditions them to be obedient little wage slaves, and when that doesn't work, we'll convince the parents to drug them.
Stand therefore, having your loins girt about with truth, and having on the breastplate of righteousness, and your feet shod with the preparation of the gospel of peace. Above all, taking the shield of faith, wherewith ye shall be able to quench all the fiery darts of the wicked, and take the helmet of salvation, and the sword of the Spirit, which is the word of God, praying always with all prayer and supplication in the Spirit, and watching thereunto with all perseverance and supplication for all saints,